Hello and welcome. I am Leanna Spurrier and I am both the presenter and the facilitator for this session. So if you all have come to some of the earlier sessions today, you may have seen me running the tech side of things. Surprise, I am also a collector. That is how I got into the industry in the first place. So I'm going to be presenting about one of my favorite series. A little bit of background info as far as work. I am the creative director for numismatic marketing. So we do all kinds of media related to coins. As far as my collection, I do some US collections, but my primary focus is Japanese bar money, which we're going to explain what that is here in a moment. But the first piece of that set is the Gaku Ichibu, which is this buddy right here. And so that is what we are going to be talking about today. So I am going to explain everything thoroughly so you don't need any kind of background information going in. I know that this is a very obscure series that most people probably don't have a lot of information on, which is part of the reason we had to solve some mysteries for this presentation. So first of all, what is Japanese bar money? It is a series of gold and silver coins that were minted in Japan from 1599 through 1869. If you have ever encountered any, it is probably one of these four. These are the most common types. They were the types that were minted at the end, so they were the ones that were not kind of melted down along the way. All of these were from the 1850s to 60s. So these are all fairly common. The most expensive one would be this larger gold one, but you can find these in the US fairly easily. However, these are all, so for the different denominations, we have 1 and 2 shu, and then 1 and 2 bu. So shu and bu are denominations like cent and dollar. 4 shu make a bu. Doesn't really matter for our contexts. The point is, this is 1 bu of silver and then 2 bu of gold, pardon me. However, the heart of the entire bar money series, which America mainly forgets and ignores, was the gold 1 bu, or Ichibu. So this is one of the later gold Ichibu types, but they were minted from 1599 all the way through 1867, with a very few short breaks in the middle. All of the other types were created from that gold Ichibu. So they didn't really start making a lot of other gold denominations until the 1800s, and they didn't start making silver rectangular pieces until the 1700s. So from 1599 through the end of the 1600s, the gold Ichibu was the only thing there was. They're also less common, which is why you don't see them as much in America and why we don't talk about them as much. However, the very first gold Ichibu was the Gaku Ichibu, except I forgot that this slide was next, so hold that thought. When researching Japanese bar money in English, there are really only 3 dedicated sources out there. So it started with Monroe, which is over here on the left, Coins of Japan. It was printed in 1904. For the time, this was the first reference on Japanese coinage that existed in English. So it was a huge improvement on what was there before, because before was nothing. However, compared to some of these later ones we're going to talk about, it is not super useful. It's not great by today's standards. Following that was Vermeil Jacobs in 1952, which was a distinct improvement on Monroe. However, I have found more problematic errors in this than I have in Monroe. So I do not recommend this book if you are looking to research Japanese bar money. If that is your goal, I highly recommend Hartill from 2011. It's on Amazon. It's like 20 bucks, and it is by far the best of these 3. It is not without problems, but it is focusing on all of early Japanese coinage. So it includes a lot of copper cash coins as well, whereas my research has only focused on the bar money. So it's a lot more focused. But Hartill is generally pretty good and fairly reliable. Now, what is the Gaku Ichibu? So this was the first gold Ichibu. It was the first rectangular coin minted in Japan, period. So there's a lot of questions with that. You know, I was very curious about this one. It was the only one with this kind of design. And so originally, this is the only information that I had on it. So I had this line drawing from in Hartill. This is a page from Hartill. He had a line drawing, and this side, no one can agree on what the obverse and reverse is. It's difficult. But this side, it has the denomination written on it, and this design changed for every design after it. So this is the only example with this design happening here. And I had a lot of questions about this. Why was it created? Like, why did they first start making rectangular coins in the first place? And Hartel did not tell me. It gives a generic description of what gold Ichibu were, like what the design is. Excuse me. And then the only thing it says specifically about the Gaku Ichibu down here, it gives the inscription. So this reads 1 bu or Ichibu. The weight, it was issued in 1599 and minted in Kyoto. And it has no Kiri crests, which is what changed on that side on later pieces, which we're going to talk about later. So this didn't answer my question. Why did they start? What was the impetus behind these pieces? So that's what I set out to learn. And at this point, this was the only illustration that I had seen of one. I had never really seen a good example of them. So I went off in hunt of pictures. And I found this one. This is the only US auction record that is on the internet. It was from Heritage. It was the 2011 sale of the Jacobs collection from that Vermeil Jacobs book from 1952. And it sold for over $16,000, as you can see. And it was great because now I had a photo. However, there was this giant counter stamp. And the description says nothing about this counter stamp. And, you know, Heritage is a reputable company. And I just was flabbergasted that they didn't mention this gigantic stamp. And at that point, I thought, well, okay, let's dig up a really good example, because this one is, you know, it looks kind of AU. It's not super great. But I wanted to see what a really great example looks like. So I went hunting. I went to Japanese auction houses and started pulling pictures and saving auction records. All in all, I found, I believe, maybe 20 to 30 examples. But these are just kind of an overview of what I found. And I noticed something. By about 6 or 7 pieces in, like you can see here, they all had that stamp. And it was all the same stamp. It's really clear in this one. There were 3 circles and then 3 triangles. And it was always in a different place on the coin. Sometimes it was on a different side of the coin, like down here. But it was always there. And none of them mentioned it. And it just wasn't reasonable that this was some merchant counter stamp that somehow managed to get on every single surviving piece. So surely it was some official part of the coin. And yet, nothing mentioned it. So I went hunting. I looked deeper into the English resources. I pulled it up in Monroe. The plates in Monroe are very hard to see. I only have the public domain PDF of it, so they are rough. But in his description, you can see here, a small rectangular coin of gold called the Ichibu kin, or 1 bu gold coin, is seen in plate number 16, number 3, which is this. On the face are the words Ichibu, and on the reverse, the name Mitsutsugu, an official of the mint. So this is what we're calling the reverse in this circumstance. 1 bu was the 4th part of a ryo. It was issued in the 4th year of Keicho, 1599. It weighed 1.2 momme, or about 4.5 grams. So that all lines up with exactly what Hartel said, and says nothing about a counter stamp. Great. So I looked at Vermeil Jacobs, which is down here. And this one perplexed me. So this is the photo of the same piece that sold from Heritage, but they're calling it a Taiko Ichibu, which I had never heard before. And they're also attributing it to 1591. This is the only place that I have ever seen 1591 referenced for these coins. I'm very confident that that was just an oversight and a mistake. That one didn't throw me too much, but Taiko was strange. I couldn't figure out where that could have come from. So now we have a new question, is that a valid name, or was that a mistake like 1591? So I went to Japanese sources. So this is a page from the JNDA catalog, which is basically the Japanese version of the Red Book. It's issued yearly, it's a nice book, it's very helpful. And so this is their entry for the Gaku Ichibu. And I've translated all of the Japanese here over on the side. And so they said, common name, Osaka Ichibu. Now we have a second new name that I have seen nowhere else before or mentioned in any English resource. So I have a lot of questions. Not to mention, they were minted in Kyoto, so why would we mention Osaka? I was very confused. Other than that, it all lines up with exactly what Hartel said, minted in 1599, weighed 4.39 grams. There was nothing else new, although it did have that same counter stamp. Now, that's not overly significant. The JNDA catalog does have pieces with after minting countermarks and merchant stamps and things like that. So that was not in and of itself a promise that this was official. Although at this point it's been on still every example that I have ever seen. So surely it's official. But the main question that came out of this was, why was it called the Osaka Ichibu? Because this is a Japanese source. So I wasn't questioning the validity of this one. Surely they know their own coins. But that was a new name. Where did it come from? Why would you call it that? For what it's worth, Gaku means tablet, and it refers to the shape. So that one was just a simple, throw it in Google Translate and the name makes sense. Osaka and Taiko, not so much. For the sake of being thorough, I did look at Friedberg, which is a book on gold coins for those who have not heard about it. Here's their entry. It has the same stamp and no further information. And at that point, I managed to stumble upon an example of one graded by PCGS. So only 3 have been graded, and at that point, there were none on CoinFacts. Since then, one has been added to CoinFacts with TrueViews, but at that point, I could not find images of any of them to see if they would straight grade with that counter stamp. So I finally found this one. It was in a blog post from PCGS, and they had thrown it up there. It wasn't even like integral to what the article was talking about, but this is like the holy grail at the moment. And if we zoom in on it here, it has the counter stamp. So what does PCGS know that I'm missing? I didn't know. I had run out of resources. I didn't know where else to check. I had ordered another book, but it was in the middle of COVID and it was on a boat coming to me for like 3 months. So I moved on, which is going to circle back. So don't think we're just ignoring the Gaku Ichibu now. That is our focus. So this is the next one. This was the Keicho Ichibu. It was minted starting in 1601, so just 2 years after the Gaku Ichibu. And you'll notice this side is basically the same. It has the same calligraphy design and everything. And it also has the same stamp. Based on the pictures I'd seen at the time, some have it, some didn't. It was additionally infuriating. But the new piece of information here is if we look at this side, this is the same side as on the Gaku Ichibu, where it only has 2 large characters. And now we have these flowers added at the top and bottom. So these are what are called kirimon. And it is one of the 2 imperial badges of Japan, consisting of 3 leaves of the Paulownia flower surmounted by 3 budding stems. I can't read. So if you look down here, we have 3 big leaves and 3 triangular stems. Interesting. It was the same shape. This was the same outline that was used for these kirimon, much simplified, but that's what it looked like it was trying to be. And I had nothing telling me that that was accurate, but there was no way that that could be a coincidence. So I believed that it was a kirimon stamp. And as I was going through auction records for these Keicho Ichibu to accumulate prices and pictures of them, I happened upon this one, which don't worry, you don't need to read the Japanese, but you'll notice this is the stamp. It's very hard to see, it's very low grade, but it is a circle and it has the same basic shape happening. I assure you that is the stamp. And if we zoom in on this part over here, the little part in brackets reads, Kiri stamped on obverse. In Japanese, they commonly shorten words, so Kiri is commonly used to represent Kirimon. Confirmation that that's what it was representing. And being an official crest of Japan, surely that was an official part of the coin. I didn't know why. Why would they take the time and effort to stamp something in addition to the design? Or why did it change sides? How was it applied? There were still a lot of questions, but the very basis, it had to be official. And then the book finally got here, the one on the boat. It took multiple months, but it finally got here off the boat. It had to come all the way from Japan in the middle of COVID. And this is a purely Japanese book. You can see how dense the Japanese text is over here on the side. This is not like the JNDA catalog where it's like half pictures and tables and short little notes. This is full-on paragraphs in Japanese, which, to be clear, I do not speak or read Japanese. So for me, translating this is going word by word. If you have ever tried to translate Japanese, if you just throw it into Google Translate, it is not effective, particularly because the words used for these coins, like bu or shu, no longer translate to the same thing. So when you put bu in Google Translate, it tries to convert that to being minute. And so when you put a whole sentence in that's talking about bu, it tries to make the sentence make sense as though it were talking about minutes. And then it loses all meaning for what you were actually trying to read. So the only way to do it is go word by word and then try to make sense of the grammar that's happening, and then use Google Translate to kind of like check it. The point being, it is a very difficult and time-intensive process, and I need to learn Japanese. I'm working on it. But flipping through the book, one of the few illustrations that I found was this one. And so I've zoomed in on the relevant part over here, and to kind of explain what these little tags mean. This was describing the minting process for gold Ichibu. So they would hammer out a strip of gold, divide it into appropriately sized and weighted pieces, cut them apart, hammer them out to a properly sized rectangle, stamp them with a little kiri stamp, and then strike the rest of the design. This was the first confirmation I had found anywhere that it was indeed part of a coin beyond my own observations. But there it was. Thank goodness. So now we know that it's official. But I still didn't know why it was there, why they would bother to put that extra step in the minting process. Because especially in the early days of minting in Japan, they did not have minting presses. They had men sitting on the floor with hammers. Okay, these were entirely struck by hand, especially at the beginning. I do not know, I've not been able to find out if they were able to kind of advance that minting process as years went on. But at the time when this type was minted in 1599, this was entirely done by hand. So adding that extra step would add a lot of extra time and effort. So what was the purpose? I got to translating. And on the page opposite, found this lovely little sentence. And I have translated this, keeping it as close to the original Japanese as possible, which means that this is not a grammatically correct sentence and uses some strange words. This is my attempt to get all of the information out of that Japanese text that I can, and not kind of force it into English grammar and possibly lose meaning. But the highlight of this passage, Godo Tedai, which we're going to come back to that phrase, but it's a person, inspected the weight of each piece. Those that passed got a little kiri or kokiri stamped on the center of the surface. It was a weight verification. That was how they were confirming that, yes, this planchet is the correct weight before they struck the entire coin. I was ecstatic to figure that out. But who is Godo Tedai? So the Godo family were a family of metalworkers who had worked for the shogunate, the ruler of Japan, for years. And so they were the ones in charge of coinage. However, the only specific member of the Godo family that I had ever seen mentioned specifically in connection with coinage was Godo Mitsutsugu, whose name is on the coins. That's not Godo Tedai, that's not the same name. And so now the new question is, who was Godo Tedai? Was that a title or was that an individual? And so commonly in Japanese, names do not translate as names. So when you put them in Google Translate, it tries to make it into words instead of names. So Godo, for example, here, if you put that into a translation engine, it gives you rear wisteria, which is really confusing until you figure out what's happening. So Tedai, if you let it translate all the way, becomes clerk. So maybe it was a Godo clerk? I was unsure. The Godo family was in charge of the gold mint, but I hadn't seen a clerk mentioned anywhere. So there's a new question. But we solved the counter stamp. And so at this point, I went back to the names. Was it really called the Taiko Ichibu, and where did Osaka come from? I did not know. However, for the answer and the researching to make sense, we need a very brief bit of Japanese culture knowledge here. So the two rulers that were in play at the time of minting were Toyotomi Hideyoshi over here. So we're just going to call him Hideyoshi because I know that's a lot of syllables. So he was the shogun ruler from 1585 to 1598, and he was based in Kyoto. Keep in mind, the Gaku Ichibu, per almost every source I have seen, were minted in 1599. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who we will just call Ieyasu, was shogun from 1603 to 1605 and was important later than that. But he was based in Edo, which is now Tokyo. Okay. So I was looking through Monroe and happened upon this sentence earlier in the same paragraph that mentions the Gaku Ichibu. The Taiko Oban was made during the Tensho and Bunroku periods, the latter ended in 1595, and issued by Taiko Hideyoshi. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. But at least this was something to go on. So I did some searching and figured that one out fairly easily in English. It was very exciting. As it turns out, Toyotomi Hideyoshi awarded himself the title of Taiko, or retired regent, which was a title higher than that of the shogun, the ruler. So that was just, it was issued under him. So Taiko Ichibu seems to be implying that it was minted under Hideyoshi. Simple enough. So with that information, I ended up here. Hideyoshi constructed a castle in Osaka, the Osaka Castle. And so he had a lot of ties to Osaka, even though his capital was in a different city. And so that seemed to explain why they may have also been called the Osaka Ichibu. Both of those names were calling back to Hideyoshi, who supposedly requested their minting. Makes sense. Except most of the resources, when I started translating things from Japanese, whenever they mentioned that or whenever they mentioned Hideyoshi, they would also say, but the connection is weak, or something along those lines, implying that maybe this isn't legitimate. But they would never explain further. Nothing that I had found talked about why they were connected to Hideyoshi in the first place, or why that was no longer something that people were confident in. And I didn't know. So I looked at the timeline. Essentially, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was based in Kyoto. So if they were minted at Hideyoshi's request, they would have been minted in Kyoto. Ieyasu was based in Edo. So if they were minted under Ieyasu, they would have been minted in Edo. So based on Hartill, he says they were minted in Kyoto, so that would suggest Hideyoshi. Looking at the timeline, Hideyoshi did start minting some coins. Japan did not really have coinage prior to this Ichibu series, but Hideyoshi did begin minting oban in 1573. So oban are extremely large gold coins. They weighed about 1/3 of a pound at the beginning and were the size of my entire hand. You can see them on the poster behind me with the black ink. They are extremely impressive and expensive, and Stax currently has a very impressive collection of them up for sale if anyone wants to spend thousands of dollars on some Japanese coins. But he did begin issuing them in 1573, but those were strictly presentation pieces. No one's going to go to the market and spend 1/3 of a pound of gold. So those were presentation pieces. Hideyoshi officially became the shogun in 1585 and then died in 1598, 1 year before the Gaku Ichibu was issued. If this was something more recent and the records were really clear, then that would seem to suggest pretty solidly that they were not minted under Hideyoshi. However, this is the 1500s. It is easy to find things that are a couple years off, and that just was not significant enough proof for me. I was not comfortable just saying, oh, nope, it wasn't Hideyoshi. They're all wrong because of that 1 year. That was not sufficient. Because Ieyasu wasn't shogun yet either. He was vying for power, but he was not in an actual official office. After Hideyoshi died, some different local rulers began fighting for control of Japan, including Ieyasu, and his victory was basically secured in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. And then the Keicho Ichibu, which was the one that we were looking at with the Kiri crests or the flowers on that one side, was first issued in 1601, and he officially became the shogun in 1603. So this is the timeline we're looking at. So now the question is not what's the connection to Hideyoshi, but rather was it issued by Hideyoshi or Ieyasu? And in connection with that, where was it minted? Because the ruler effectively determines the location in this case. So in translating that book from Japan that came on the boat, I ended up on this passage. And the important part here, based on Godo Mitsutsugu's signature stamp die, the house of Tokugawa Ieyasu decreed that casting would be done in Edo. Okay, so that didn't translate super great to English or very explanatory, but it was enough, because that suggested that Mitsutsugu's name had something to do with proving where it was minted. So that's the rabbit hole I went down. So just to kind of explain where that came from, this right here is Mitsutsugu. That is how that name is written. And it is clearly written on this one side, commonly used the obverse, not always, of all gold coins of the bar money series, starting with, of course, the Gaku Ichibu. So it's very hard to see if you're not familiar with Asian calligraphy. It took me multiple months of staring at these to be able to figure out what strokes correlated to what. But here, the colors line up. So we had 3 strokes up here. Those are these 3 strokes, and then the horizontal and the 2. Okay, I don't need to walk through all of them. But you can see that these line up. And I have not seen a single source that disagreed on what this was trying to say. So the fact that this reads Mitsutsugu is not in question. So then I started researching, okay, what can we do with that information? What can we learn about Mitsutsugu himself that might clear up anything at this point? So I got to looking, and I found this book from the early 1900s about Japanese history with the full Godo family line clearly marked out with years and names and all of this, and it seemed lovely. So I've kind of summarized it over here on the side. Currently, what we know is that Godo Mitsutsugu was alive and working in 1599, and there was probably a Godo Tedai. We still haven't cleared that one up. That was the clerk or Tedai, unclear which one. So those are the 2 things that we're trying to figure out here. And so if we look at this Godo family line, it started back in the early 1400s. The 3 in yellow are the ones who would have been alive and old enough to be working in 1599, none of whom were given the name Mitsutsugu. Based on this book, Tokujo, who is number 5 over here, was also called Mitsutsugu. Okay. But as I started looking at other English resources, they seemed to be about a 50-50 split, where half of them said, yes, Tokujo was also Mitsutsugu. And then half of them said that that was not the case at all, and that Mitsutsugu was someone else originally who was given the name Mitsutsugu later and kind of adopted into the Godo family. And so I ended up having to wind my way into more Japanese sources for that, and ultimately found a documentary series that cleared it up. But the most concise explanation in English was this from an article that I found online. So we're going to use this as opposed to trying to pull multiple 3-second clips from that Japanese documentary. So what this article said, no one from the Godo family went to Edo because they had for this duty their clerk, Shozaburo. So kind of context for this, which I should have given before reading the sentence, was Ieyasu had requested that a member of the Godo family be sent to him in Edo for metalworking purposes. And no one in the Godo family wanted to do that. They were all very loyal to Hideyoshi, and so they just kind of shoved their clerk over and said, you go take care of it. So Shozaburo, the clerk, met Ieyasu personally in 1593 and became the official Edo representative of the Godo family 2 years later in 1595. With this important appointment, he was allowed to bear the family name Godo and their 353 Kiri crest, and got also the name Mitsutsugu. So there was never a person by the name of Goto Mitsutsugu working in Kyoto. The person who became Mitsutsugu was sent to Edo and then given the name. And that is where he stayed. He resided permanently in Edo as of 1595. And he traveled to other places later in his career. Kyoto was not one of them, per what I have seen. But his primary location was Edo. And especially through the early 1600s, he was in Edo. And that began an entire new branch of the Goto family that descended from him, which is less relevant to our current research. However, that proves that the Gaku Ichibu had to have been minted in Edo. Mitsutsugu's name is on it. He was never working in Kyoto. By the time that he was given that name, he was only in Edo. So it had to be issued in Edo under Ieyasu, which started to form a narrative. So some of the other fun little facts that I stumbled upon in research that have not wound their way in so far. In the mid to late 1500s, mining in Japan was increasing, so they had more gold and silver available. So at that point, to transfer them as currency, what they would generally do is they would have gold dust in little bags, and they would stamp the bags with an official seal to indicate that they were, approved by the shogunate. And then they would just trade those, and they had to weigh them every time that they traded hands. And it's gold in a bag. That's not a convenient method of commerce. But they had more gold and silver available to them, which is why coinage started to become a realistic possibility. So when Hideyoshi died, multiple local leaders started vying for power, one of whom was Ieyasu. And Ieyasu had been rising the ranks pretty much his entire life. We don't need to get into his whole complicated backstory, but he had been gaining significant power throughout his life in the attempts to ultimately become the shogun. And so shortly before this, he had moved to Edo, which was originally a small fishing town. And as he was trying to accumulate more power and wealth, he was growing Edo and trying to create a blossoming commerce center. So he wanted to strengthen his territory in Edo. And so one of the ways that he planned to do that was to make commerce easier, trying to drive more merchants to his territory. And so he planned to do that by minting coinage. The Gaku Ichibu. That was his plan to gain strength and power and strengthen his territory so that he would have a stronger basis on which to claim power. So when he did ultimately get control of the country, he then implemented that kind of test local coinage with the Gaku Ichibu on a national scale. And that is where the Keicho Ichibu came from. And we finally figured out the impetus. Finally. Along the way, there were some other interesting little things that came up and that were not huge, big mysteries, but are worth mentioning. So just to summarize, they have an NQ's Kirimon stamp that was used as a weight verification before the rest of the coin was struck. They were minted in Edo under Tokugawa Ieyasu and originally intended as a regional coin and served as a prototype for the future national coinage system, coinage system, which survived until 1869. And then they were also known as the Taiko Ichibu and Osaka Ichibu because they used to be attributed to Hideyoshi. More recent research in Japan has confirmed that that was erroneous, and now in English because nothing explained it. The purity is believed to be 84.3% gold. Only one source has actually mentioned that. Everything else I've seen has said it is unknown, but the one book from the boat did say that it is believed to be 84.3%, which is the composition of the Keicho Ichibu that followed. So it makes sense. That is not something that is confirmed, but it is a hypothesis. Also interesting is sometimes they have a textured field on the reverse, this side, the one pictured at the bottom, and sometimes they do not. Based on what I've seen, this is not usually mentioned in auctions. It doesn't seem to impact the value. It was just an interesting note that nothing else really acknowledges. And the mintage is unknown. I have seen nothing that even makes an attempt to estimate a mintage, much to my frustration. So one other thing that I have discovered in all of this is some pricing trends. So there are some price guides out there that attempt to assign a value to them. Based on what I have found, they're not super accurate. So this is the conglomeration of every auction record that is indexed on the internet that I have been able to locate from 2010 to 2020. I believe there has been one sale since 2021 started, which is not on this chart, but it did not break any of these patterns. It was well within the norms established on this chart. So all of the red down here are pieces that sold within Japan. This is one that went unsold in Japan. It actually came up for auction twice at the same price and still has not sold. And then this is the one that sold in the US. So to look a little closer at some of these, this was the least expensive one to sell within Japan. It was for about $5,500 or 600,000 yen, and it's rough. So these were not super well struck, which is going to become more clear as we look at some nicer ones. This one has a lot of weakness happening over here on the side. You can tell with how it's a lot crisper, see up in this corner, and then it just kind of disappears into nothing down here, that was not from wear, that was from an uneven strike. These were usually unevenly struck because they were struck by hand. And that carries on through pretty much the entire gold bar money series. Almost all of them, the norm is to find some form of weakness. This is a very dramatic example, especially in the later types. It is not nearly as common, but it is something that's very prevalent, and it's not something that we think of as much coming from US coinage. So that is something to note. But you can see that this one is worn. It's also a terrible picture. But so this is the nicest one that has actually sold in Japan, which is a distinct improvement, clearly. It does still have some weakness. You can see on this one, it's in this kind of bottom third mainly. If you look at the top, there's a lot more definition on the edges of the designs, whereas down here, they become a lot more flat and two-dimensional. And then that's reflected on the reverse as well. These are struck in metal orientation. They are not coin orientation. So the bottom is the bottom on both sides. And then the weakness is very clear on the reverse as well, where you can see like this line is going to be very tall and kind of pointed, whereas down here, they're a lot more flat and shallow. However, it is clearly uncirculated. There is no evidence of wear that you can see from these pictures. Having looked at a lot of these, this is one of the nicer examples that I have seen. So it does not surprise me that it was the most expensive record that I have found from in Japan. This is the one that did not sell, that was priced more expensively, and it is a much better picture, which makes one inclined to say, yes, that one's better. But it is not as sharp. It's most obvious in this character right here. This is the one, or Ichi. If you look here, this is clearly kind of rounded at the top, whereas on the previous one, it looks much more angled and crisp. Worth noting, centering is also something to look for these. So this one, you can see this border up here or over here and at the bottom are complete, whereas the dots are entirely cut off on this side. This side is decently centered. Finding one with full borders is very, very uncommon. I'm honestly not sure if I have found one of these with full borders on both sides. I expect it would command quite a premium. Other types with full borders do. So yes, and on this one, you can see the weakness is very prevalent down here in this corner. The design basically disappears because it was so wonkily struck. And then this is the one, the only one that has sold in the US. It was the Jacob's example that we saw earlier. It is now graded AU53. This is the one that has appeared on CoinFacts now. I still haven't found the one AU55 that has been graded. So if anyone knows where that is, please let me know. But this one is now on CoinFacts. It's AU. It's fairly obvious looking at the pictures that it is not as nice as either of these from Japan. I think the lack of useful price records probably drove the price up when sold in the US. So I'm very curious to see if future pieces that are sold in this country follow those trends or not, to be determined. This is the MS62 from PCGS, which we saw a little bit earlier. I'm bringing it back in now that we have seen some others to compare it to a bit more objectively. It is not very well struck, honestly. It is uncirculated, clearly, because it's graded, but especially looking at this side, it is extremely mushy. You know, all of the lot, it's just very mushy. And I haven't seen a lot of that with these. You know, they're commonly flat, like you can see up here, but they're usually, at least the edges are crisp, which is not happening over here. So that's kind of an oddball. But this one, according to a Japanese blog post, was for sale in Japan for about $62,000 in 2019 or 2020, which don't feel like it's going to sell at that. Someone was putting a really big premium on that holder. In Japan, grading is not a very big thing. They tend to prefer their coins raw, similar to a lot of ancient coin collectors in the US. So you don't see a lot of graded bar money, which is part of the reason the populations are so small. I mentioned only 3 of these are graded. Obviously, there are a lot more than 3 surviving. We've seen pictures of more than 3. They just don't do a lot of grading over in Japan. So if they don't make it to the US, they're probably not making it to PCGS 80% of the time. So this is a very small sample of what's out there as far as what's actually been to PCGS. Also worth pointing out, NGC does not grade these. I'm not just omitting them. Only PCGS will accept bar money. So that's why we've only discussed them. And finally, these are the actual price guides that I have found. So the JNDA is first. This is the Japanese version of the Red Book. They don't give grades like we do in the US. They just attribute low, middle, or high. And their definitions of those are not necessarily what we would expect. However, even at that, the lowest price that they give is over $19,000, which is not even on the chart. So that their pricing as a whole is generally pretty overshot. I've noticed that throughout all of the different types that I've seen. So it's mainly useful for comparing types to one another. Looking at some of the English sources, Friedberg gives 21,000 and 14,000 for high and low. And 14,000 is, at least on the graph, although it is for the nicest one that has sold in Japan. So I'm not sure that low is quite the proper identifier for that. Hartill does not give explicit values. He was attempting to make it a little bit more timeless as a resource. So he gives rarity ratings that he then relates to approximate price ranges. So he deemed these ER star, which lines up with over about $9,500. So that is somewhat accurate. That's about in the middle here of the sales. So the point of this is, if you are looking to buy one, do not trust these price guides. Frankly, if you're looking to buy one, go to Japan. It will probably be a lot more reasonable compared to in the US, especially if future US records follow the trend set by the single one from 2011. There has at least been one other one sold in the US that was before that. I have not been able to track down the sale price of that one because it was not sold online. So still working on that, but the end. So I'm going to stop that. And so now if you have any questions, just click on the little Q&A button at the bottom and type them in, and I will get to as many as we can before we run out of time. I see a few already in here. Okay, what got you interested in this series in the first place? So I was doing a video for the Newman Numismatic Portal about coins of weird shapes. And so I was just looking for strangely shaped coins and scrolling through World Coin Gallery, looking at pictures for anything that was not a circle. And I found one of the silver rectangular pieces, one of the most common ones. I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because normally when you see rectangular coins, they, were struck in a collar and they have rounded edges so they don't stab your fingers when you grab them. And it didn't. It had very sharp corners. It was clearly not struck in a collar or anything like that. And so I thought that's really interesting. And so I got one for that video, which I needed to do. And then I was fascinated and I wanted to learn more about it and figure out what it said. It was ridiculously difficult on that one to figure out what the legends were. It has more actual Japanese text on it than the gold ones we've been looking at, and nothing was clear enough for me, and it didn't work if you put it in Google Translate, and it was just infuriating. And so I kind of started diving down the rabbit hole. And I ended up buying one of the later gold types, and I got Hartill along with it. And I thought that Hartill would answer all of my questions, and it did not. It helped a lot. Like I said, Hartill is excellent, highly recommend if you're looking for information, but it was not the like narrative book that I wanted. I wanted something telling me the history behind all of these pieces and why they were minted and why they changed and all of this. And it just, that's not what Hartill is. That's not what it's trying to do. So at that point, I decided, okay, the book I want doesn't exist. May as well write it. So that is the goal. I am ultimately going to be writing a book on the entire series. The current goal for that is 2030, so don't hold your breath. But it is definitely in progress. If you want to know more about them, I do have a website up with kind of some of the research I've done so far. This video will be going up on it as well. It is rectanglecoins.com. And if anyone forgets that or has a question or anything, just go to the Symposium website, go to contact us, and then send a message, and I will get back to you on whatever it is. I'm always happy to talk about rectangles. Let's see. Thank you for the compliments in the Q&A. I appreciate them. Let's see. You mentioned the extra circular countermark was placed on the coin before striking. A lot of your examples seem to show the circular countermark as if it was done after striking. Can you discuss? That is a problem. That is one of the questions that remains. Some of them, it does look like it was done before the striking, like there isn't a clear impact on the opposite side, but on a lot of them, it does seem to have been done after striking. I do not have an answer for that right now. That is one of the remaining questions for these pieces. I have found a book that seems as though it may talk more about the minting processes at the gold mint, and I'm hoping that that might have some of the answers. I've not been able to purchase that book yet, but it is on my list of future leads. So I hope to find that answer eventually. That day is not today. I wish I had an answer for you. Let's see here. Heritage, let's try that again. Heritage has been selling a large number of 4 coin sets in genuine holders. Do you know who imported these or is promoting them? They're all PCGS certified, not graded, and go for between $200 and $300 for the sets of 1 shoe, 2 shoe, 1 boo, and 2 boo. Silver and gold coins from the 1850s to 1860s seem to be in high grade condition. They're being offered regularly in their weekly auctions. Yes. I do not know where they came from. I don't have that information. I have seen them. I have looked at every single group of them. I have tracked every single one of them. In general, that is not how I would recommend purchasing these. They are sets. They are commonly, I've seen a lot that are likely to be problem coins, as though they would not have straight graded if they were indeed in graded holders. And one thing to note, you mentioned they seem to be in high grade. Most of these are. These were fairly high value coins. Even the lowest denomination of bar money, which was a silver 1 shoe coin from the 1850s, which is included in those sets. They were a 1 day's pay for a construction worker when they were minted. And all of the other coins are more valuable than that. So these were not coins that were trading hands multiple times a day, paying for bread and rice. Like these were, they had value. These were more akin to double equals in the US than half dollars. So really with actual graded examples, there are very few that you find below AU. And most of the silver ones are easily findable in MS grades, especially if you look to Japan. So commonly the ones in those holders, I would put more around AU than MS. And generally, if you are looking for, a high grade, nice collection of these, I would recommend going for MS. That rule does change a little bit for gold. It is a lot harder to get above AU for the gold, and most of them do not come above MS 63. There are some exceptions, but normally 62 is kind of the sweet spot for the gold pieces. And most of those I would not expect to land there. So I'm not saying that they're a bad thing. I'm glad that we are getting more of these pieces out there in the world and more people are seeing them. And it makes me happy that you have seen those and know what they were. However, if you are looking for like a serious collection that is more than look at my samurai coins, and there's nothing wrong with look at my samurai coins, but if you are looking for a more complete set, I would highly recommend going to eBay, finding raw or graded pieces for those common types. You can find them graded on eBay. The rarer types are a lot harder to get in the US, but those common types really are not, and they are findable and achievable. That's not the right word. So yes, I wish I knew where they came from. Yeah, I see those holders all over the place. Since Heritage started selling them, a lot of the individual coins pop up on eBay. It's strange. Get one that's graded. That is what I would recommend. Yes, and if you have bought a set of them, that's great. I'm glad that you have rectangles. If it's up to you. If you want to have them graded, then go for it. I do not know how to get those labels with the little samurai dude on them. I think those are some part of special cooperation that they have with Heritage or whoever is sending those in. So if you like that label, then do not send them in because it will not come back with that label. So yes. Okay. Isn't it likely that at least one of the pieces you saw would be counterfeit? It's possible, for sure. I have seen counterfeits of these. Most of the time when I have seen counterfeits, they are horrifying. I have not seen very many good counterfeits. And if I have, then they are good enough that they have gotten by Japanese auction houses. Pretty much all of the examples that I found were from reputable Japanese auction houses. So I have to trust that they knew what they were doing in cataloging and identified any counterfeits and weeded them out. I have seen counterfeits of them. Most of them are very, very crude. And if you have seen more than 2 examples of these, it is pretty easy to pick out when it is a counterfeit. I know a lot of people get very concerned about counterfeits for this entire series. And they are out there, but I have not seen many that are decent. And I am fairly careful whenever looking at them online, especially on eBay. You know, you've got to be careful because they are normally raw. But 99% of the time, there's very little question about which way it would swing. Nothing that I have ever purchased has come back counterfeit when I've sent it to PCGS. So I'm sure they're out there. My recommendation, if one is afraid of counterfeits in researching or purchasing the series, learn them, look at as many pictures as you can find from reputable places, and buy them from reputable dealers. You know, if they are on eBay, but that is not the only place to get them. I do sell these from time to time, so if you are looking for a specific type or anything like that, send me a message and I can get one for you. So just looking at reputable places is something as well. So yes. I think the Jacob specimen went high because of the pedigree. Every big Japanese dealer was in the sales room that night and they bought most of the non-machine struck coins. At that time, the China market was very hot, so that may have helped too. That is very interesting context that I did not know. I was not involved with this series yet by 2011, and so I was not even aware of that auction as it was happening. I was doing homework at that time. So that is very interesting, and I'm going to save that note for later. So thank you for that. The Jacob's pedigree is definitely relevant. He had a whole collection that sold at the same time. And I know at least one of those pieces did end up in a PCGS registry set collection. It is still in that collection. It is on the registry set. That is the only one that I know where it went, and I don't know who owns that set. I just know that that's where it is. So yeah, it's an interesting sale. I've spent a lot of time looking at those pieces and kind of comparing them to other things. And there were a lot of interesting things happening with that sale that I've done some looking into. Let's see, and just a note here, your best defense against fakes is 20 times magnification, get a 20 power glass and carry it. A lot of it with these as well is just really knowing them inside and out. Like one of the, well, I guess that's true for any coin series, but just having looked at even like 10 examples of one is going to give you a much better basis than if you just come in with like the one picture from Hartel or the JNDA or whatever it is. Because even looking at that small number of them, you get a better idea for kind of the average style and what level of crudeness is acceptable. Because they were crude. They were not fancy, nicely machine struck coins like America had by the late 1800s. They were still struck by hand as far as I'm aware. And even if they were not by hand, they were still fairly crude. So there is a lot of variation within them, but once you've looked at enough examples, it becomes pretty clear what the acceptable range of variation was. One thing that you cannot use to identify counterfeits is comparing the calligraphy. The calligraphy styles varied all over the place. It is ridiculous. Like if this was an American series, there would be so many books about it. It's not even funny. Just analyzing different types and designs and all of these things. But there's not. So I'm working on it. Let's see, what's the highest grade you've seen on a rectangle? It moved. There we go. On a rectangle of any type. Do any get above MS65? Yes. The later silver pieces, so I'm going to say 1850s and later silver types as a very general rule, 1830s and later, yeah. They are seen in MS66. I have never seen one above 66 plus. And for the gold, with a singular exception that I'm aware of, they top out at MS64. I have seen one in MS66. And it is actually one of the Keicho Ichibu, and my jaw dropped when it showed up on Coin Facts. It was shocking. I don't know where that came from. So they do get decent. There are some higher grades out there to be found. Let's see. And yes, the fakes are generally cast, not hammered. So that is also a good thing to note. These were hammered. With the silver types, there's generally some clear luster around the borders. That's not so much with the gold types. Sometimes the fields were textured, sometimes they weren't, and it's a rectangle. So you're not gonna have like the cartwheel luster that you would look for on a US coin. They just don't do that. So that's something to point out as well. Let's see. Was the NQ's guarantee stamp on the silver pieces what led you down the path of a sayer for the gold counter stamp, or was it an independent observation? That was an independent observation. So what that person is talking about on the later silver issues, they all have an NQ stamp. It reads guaranteed, and it was intended to kind of validate the denomination and help give the public confidence that yes, this is real silver, it is legitimate, everything is good. Increasing public confidence in their coinage was a very big concern for the Japanese. So that did not occur to me originally for the counter stamp. I was initially very convinced that it was an aftermarket thing because that drawing in Hartel did not include it. And I was just shocked that something so large could have made it past that observation. Upon further contemplation, these are very rare. And all of these books were written before the internet had really like come into its own, especially with the Japanese auction houses. Most of them, the records don't go back before 2011. And so when Hartel was writing in 2011, well, that's what he published, there wouldn't have been a whole lot of examples that he could easily find. He would have had to actually like connect with people who had them. And I don't know how many examples he came into contact with versus just looking at references. And so it's altogether possible that those earlier authors had only seen one or two examples and made the same assumption that I originally did, that it was an aftermarket stamp. I have no validation for that or any like background information. That is just a theory of mine that may have been why it was omitted from sources for so long. Okay, and we're about out of time, so I'm going to answer one more question and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Are you considering to write an article or publication on the Gaku Ichibu? Other than the language barrier, what would be the challenges of this investigation? So I am ultimately planning to write a book, which I mentioned earlier. I don't currently have any plans to explicitly write an article about the Gaku Ichibu. This video is my publication of that research. I may change that decision and end up writing one. It would probably appear on Coin Week if I do. I have a relationship with them. I wrote for them a while back. So that could happen. If you do want to keep up with like updates into research and stuff, on that Rectangle Coins website, there's an option to sign up for email updates. And I will send out emails whenever I update the site or do things like publishing an article somewhere or doing videos like this. So if you'd like to stay abreast of updates, head over to that website and sign up for email updates. And this video will be posted there as well if anyone wants to go back and reference it or share it with your friends. So I believe that will wrap us up. Thank you all for joining me. This is a very unusual topic, and I appreciate that so many people have taken an interest in it. I love it. It is something I'm very excited about. So I'm glad to see other people learning about it, and thank you. So we have one more presentation left today for the symposium. It is Pete Smith talking about some other strange things that are associated to numismatics. So that one should have already started. If you want to go check in on that, I went a minute over. My bad. So I'm going to wrap that up. Thank you all for joining me. Hope to see you all back at the symposium throughout the week and weekend.